6 years from the night this story begins, a mantle bearing a duke's crest will be laid over the shoulders of a child no one in that church expects to claim. And the silence that follows will outlast the vicar's own sermon. But tonight, there is no church, no mantle, no name spoken aloud. There is only a storm over Kirkland Hall, a gate no one wants him to pass, and a sound coming from inside that house he was never meant to hear. The storm had been falling over Kirkland Hall since noon, the kind of rain that turned gravel drives into rivers and made even the horses reluctant to move. But Nathaniel Vane, Duke of Amberley, had ridden through worse to settle matters of business he considered beneath postponement. He was 34 that year, a widower of 6 winters, known in the clubs of London for saying little and meaning all of it. And the summons from Kirkland's steward had arrived that morning, with a hurry in the handwriting that told him something was wrong long before he read a single word of the letter itself. The gates of Kirkland Hall stood open when he arrived, which was itself a strangeness, for a house that prided its iron and its distance from the road. A manservant met him under the portico with a lantern shaking more from nerves than from wind, and behind him, through a side door left ajar, came a sound Nathaniel had not expected to hear in a duke's household after dark. The thin, insistent crying of an infant, and beneath it, the low, hurried voices of people trying to silence something they had already decided did not exist. He asked once whose child it was. The steward would not answer him directly, which was answer enough. And it was in the silence that followed, the particular silence of servants trained not to repeat what they had seen, that Nathaniel understood he had ridden into something far larger than a matter of unpaid accounts. He stepped past the manservant without being invited to, and the rain came in with him. The room they had put her in was not a nursery. It was a back parlor stripped of its furniture, cold enough that Nathaniel could see his own breath, and in a basket meant for linens lay a girl no older than a few months, wrapped in a servant's shawl too thin to do more than mark her as someone's afterthought. A housemaid stood over her, weeping quietly and uselessly. And when she saw the Duke of Amberley in the doorway, she did not curtsy. She simply stepped aside, as though she had been waiting all evening for someone with the authority to stop what was about to happen. Nathaniel had left his traveling cloak in the hall, an old gray thing without embroidery, without the ducal crest his valet insisted he wear on formal calls, chosen that morning only because the weather demanded it. He went back for it himself. When he returned, he lifted the child from the basket with the particular carefulness of a man who had held his own infant only once, years before, in the hour before the fever took her, and he wrapped the girl in the plain gray wool because it was the only warm thing within reach, and because he would understand only later. An unmarked coat was exactly what a nameless child required. She stopped crying almost at once, which undid something in him more thoroughly than the storm outside ever could. He asked the housemaid, quietly now, where the child was meant to go before morning. She told him the parish, the workhouse register, a cart already arranged, and Nathaniel Vane, who had not raised his voice in that house nor anywhere else in a decade, said only that the cart would not be needed, and that the girl was leaving with him instead. 3 months earlier, the girl had a name spoken openly in that house, and a woman who used it. Cecilia Fairweather had come to Kirkland Hall as a nursery governess the previous spring, engaged to oversee the education of the Duke of Kirkland's legitimate grandchildren, and had found herself, within a fortnight, quietly and without instruction, caring for another child entirely. An infant kept apart from the family wing, referred to by the staff only as the girl. Born to a woman none of them were permitted to discuss, and dead before the child's first month was out. Cecilia had asked more than once what was to become of her. She had asked gently at first, then plainly, And finally, on the afternoon, Charles Winslow, Duke of Kirkland, informed his household that the child would be sent to the parish before the summer season began, so that no guest of the family need ever learn she existed. Cecilia had said, in front of the housekeeper and 2 footmen, that a man who could hold a title and not hold his own blood was no duke she cared to serve. She was dismissed within the hour, without a character reference, and without the wages owed her for the quarter, on the grounds of insolence toward her employer. What the household remembered afterward was not the insolence, but the stillness with which she accepted it. She did not plead, did not weep where they could see her, only asked once more, at the door, what would become of the child, and was told, with the particular cruelty of people relieved to stop feeling guilty, that it was no longer any concern of hers. For 3 months, Cecilia Fairweather learned what it meant to carry a dismissal with no reference attached to it. 3 households considered her for governess positions, and 3 withdrew their offers once a single letter arrived from Kirkland Hall, unsigned but unmistakable in its origin, warning of a woman unsuited to positions of trust. She took in mending to pay for her lodgings in a boarding house in Tunbridge Wells, and told herself, on the nights it was hardest, that she had at least said the true thing when it mattered, even if the truth had cost her everything else. It was Amberley's steward who found her, not by accident, but by instruction. Nathaniel had asked quietly who the child's nurse had been before the household scattered the truth of her existence, and had not stopped asking until a name surfaced. He did not send a footman with a summons. He came himself to the boarding house, hat in hand, in a hallway that smelled of damp plaster, and told her plainly that he had the girl she had once cared for, that he required a governess who would not look away from an inconvenient child, and that he was aware, entirely, of why no other house in the county would employ her. Cecilia did not answer him at once. She asked instead to see the child first, as though the position mattered less than the proof that the girl was warm and fed and wanted. And when Nathaniel brought her the following week to a drawing-room at Amberley and set the girl down on the carpet between them, the child took 3 unsteady steps towards Cecilia's skirts before either adult had said another word. It was, Nathaniel would think often in the years that followed, the entire negotiation settled in silence, by someone not yet old enough to speak. Amberley's staff had buried a duchess 6 years before, and had learned, in the long quiet that followed, how to hold a household together around a grief no one named aloud. They received the news of a nameless infant and a disgraced governess the way they had received every other difficult thing under Nathaniel's roof, without comment in his hearing, and with a great deal of unspoken efficiency the moment his back was turned. A cradle was found in an attic within a day. A wet nurse from the village was engaged within 2. No one below stairs asked whose child she was, because the housekeeper made it known once that the question would not be asked twice. The gray traveling cloak that had carried her from Kirkland Hall was washed, folded, and set into a chest at the foot of the new nursery bed. Not out of sentiment anyone would admit to, but because no one in the house could quite bring themselves to give it away. Cecilia found it there within the month, and understood its meaning before anyone explained it to her. An unmarked coat, kept by an unmarked family, in a house that had decided collectively, and without ever holding a meeting about it, that the girl belonged exactly where she had landed. By the time autumn turned the drive to gold, the child had a name chosen from Nathaniel's late wife's favorite hymn, Iris, for the promise after a storm, and a household that would have denied, to any visitor bold enough to ask, that there had ever been anything unusual about a duke raising a foundling as his own. London had not yet heard a whisper of it. That, everyone under Amberley's roof understood without saying so, was precisely how long the silence was meant to last. By the spring of 1847, the story of the Duke of Amberley's ward had settled into something the county found easier to ignore than to explain. There was a child at Amberley Hall. That much no one could deny, since she rode in the carriage beside Nathaniel at the harvest fair and curtsied prettily enough at the rare dinners he still consented to host. But whose child she was, and by what right she bore his name informally, if not yet legally, remained a question. London's drawing rooms had decided was safer left unasked in his presence. Nathaniel had grown, in those 6 years, into a kind of quiet the county mistook for coldness. He answered invitations with brevity, attended church with punctual regularity, and left before the gossip in the churchyard could properly begin, and conducted his business with the same unbending fairness he had always been known for, so that even the families most eager to whisper about Amberley found no fault in his ledgers or his tenants' rents to whisper about instead. What he would not do, under any pressure of etiquette, was explain Iris to anyone who had not troubled to ask him kindly. Cecilia had watched this silence built around them both like a second set of walls, and had come, without quite deciding to admire the particular discipline it required. She had expected, when she accepted the position, that scandal would follow the child everywhere. What she had not expected was a man willing to let the scandal exhaust itself against his own reputation, rather than let it touch a 6-year-old girl who had done nothing but be born to people too proud to claim her. That silence, so carefully built over 6 years, was never going to hold forever. Amberley had learned to protect it from the county's curiosity. But no one in that household had yet reckoned with a cousin who had never once troubled himself to visit, until the exact year he had a reason to start asking who, precisely, was living under Nathaniel's roof. The schoolroom at Amberley had been furnished for a governess and a single pupil, and for 6 years it had held, most mornings, a third occupant no one had requested. Nathaniel began coming to the lessons not out of any stated intention, but by accident of habit. A question about estate correspondence that led him past the schoolroom door, a pause to listen, a reluctance to leave once he had heard Iris sound out her letters with the fierce concentration of a child determined not to disappoint the one person who never raised his voice at her. Cecilia noticed him in the doorway long before she acknowledged it, and made a private rule of neither inviting him in nor sending him away, on the theory that a man who wished to learn patience by watching a child learn her alphabet was doing no harm to anyone. He took, in time, to correcting Iris's sums over her shoulder when Cecilia's back was turned, and to pretending, when caught, that he had merely been passing through on a state business that happened to require him to stand motionless behind a 7-year-old's chair for the better part of an hour. It was Cecilia who first said aloud what the household had long observed in silence, that a duke who found time, every morning, to watch a child form her letters was not a man discharging an obligation, but a man building, deliberately and without ceremony, the only kind of family he still believed himself capable of having. Nathaniel did not deny it. He only asked quietly whether it showed so plainly, and Cecilia told him, just as quietly, that it had shown for some years now, to everyone in the house but him. The occasion that revealed him most thoroughly to his own staff came not from any grand gesture, but from an ordinary Tuesday, when Cecilia was called away to Tunbridge Wells to nurse a sister through a fever, and left Nathaniel, for the better part of 3 days, entirely responsible for a 7-year-old girl who had strong opinions about the arrangement of her own hair. He had never attempted such a thing in his life, had in fact never once considered that a duke's education included no instruction whatsoever in ribbons, and spent the better part of the first morning producing a plait so lopsided that Iris regarded it in the looking-glass with the frank disappointment only a child can deliver without cruelty. He did not summon a maid to correct his failure, though 3 stood ready in the corridor and would gladly have taken the task from him. Instead, he asked Iris to show him again, slowly, and knelt behind her chair with the same unhurried attention he gave to matters of tenancy and inheritance, undoing his own work twice before the plait sat even against her shoulders. By the third morning, the household had grown accustomed to the sight of the Duke of Amberley, sleeves rolled to the elbow, murmuring instructions to himself under his breath in the nursery mirror. Cecilia returned to find the arrangement holding steady, if not quite fashionable, and said nothing beyond a compliment on Iris's hair that made the girl beam with pride at her own achievement rather than anyone else's. But she understood. Watching Nathaniel that evening explain to his steward with perfect gravity why the estate accounts had waited 3 days, that she had witnessed something the county would never believe of him even if she described it plainly. A man who had learned, alone and without an audience, exactly how much of himself a child required. The county's spring assembly had been held at the same rooms in Maidstone for as long as anyone could recall, and for 6 years running the Duke of Amberley's name had appeared on its guest list out of habit rather than welcome, until the year the committee, quietly, without a letter of explanation, omitted it altogether. Nathaniel learned of the omission not through any formal notice but through his steward, who had heard it from a tradesman, who had heard it from a housemaid at the Ainsworth residence, in the particular manner that county news travelled fastest through the servants' halls it was never meant to reach. He said nothing of it to Cecilia for a week, and might have said nothing at all had she not found the invitation list herself, delivered by mistake to Amberley, along with an order of dress fabric, his name conspicuously absent from a page listing every other family of consequence within 20 miles. She watched him read it over without expression, fold it once, and set it aside with the same composure he brought to unfavorable harvest reports. And it was that composure, more than any complaint he might have made, that told her precisely how much the slight had cost him. Iris, too young to understand assemblies, but old enough to sense a household holding its breath, asked at supper why they were not attending the dance everyone at the vicarage had mentioned, and Nathaniel told her, simply, that some houses preferred smaller company, and that Amberley had never needed Maidstone's rooms to enjoy an evening together. Cecilia said nothing at the table, but that night she took down the grey cloak from its chest at the foot of the nursery bed and mended a small tear at its hem that had gone unrepaired for years, as though the gesture itself were the only argument she had left to make. Sunday services offered no such convenient absence, since a duke who ceased attending church invited exactly the sort of speculation Nathaniel had spent 6 years avoiding, and so the household continued its weekly walk to the village chapel with the same regularity as ever, Iris between them in her best bonnet, Cecilia a careful half-step behind, in the position propriety assigned a governess rather than the position the household privately understood her to hold. It was there, across the narrow aisle, that Lady Constance Ainsworth had perfected, over the better part of 6 years, a particular expression she reserved exclusively for Cecilia Fairweather. It was not a scowl, nor anything so honest as open contempt. Lady Constance was too practiced a hostess for that, but a long, unhurried study that began at Cecilia's plain bonnet and ended, invariably, at her ungloved hands folded in her lap, as though counting the ways in which a dismissed governess ought to have found the decency to disappear rather than resurface, respectably employed, in a duke's own pew. She never spoke the thought aloud in the chapel. She did not need to. The look alone had, over the years, done its work in every drawing-room between Amberley and Maidstone. On this particular Sunday, however, it was Nathaniel who caught the look before Cecilia did, and who held Lady Constance's gaze a moment longer than courtesy required, without any softening of his own expression to suggest apology. He said nothing to her after the service beyond the barest civility custom demanded, but Cecilia, walking home beside him with Iris's small hand in hers, understood that something in the balance of that look had shifted, That the Duke of Amberley, who had spent 6 years letting scandal exhaust itself quietly against his own name, had just decided, in the space of a single glance across a church aisle, that he would not let it exhaust itself against hers indefinitely. Edgar Winslow arrived at Amberley on a Thursday in early autumn, unannounced by more than a single line dispatched that same morning, which was itself a discourtesy calculated to catch the household without the customary hour of preparation a proper visit demanded. He came dressed for business rather than pleasure, in a dark coat too formal for a social call, and boots too clean for a man who claimed, as he did within the first 5 minutes of being shown into the drawing-room, to have simply been passing through Kent on his way from London to his own modest estate in Surrey, and thought it only civil to pay his respects to a neighbor he had, in truth, never once called upon in the 6 years since Amberley had taken in its ward. Nathaniel received him with the particular courtesy he reserved for men he did not trust, offering tea, offering the good chairs by the window, offering nothing at all of the information Edgar had so plainly ridden 2 counties to obtain, and watched with something close to contempt as his visitor's eyes moved, again and again, toward the doorway through which a child's laughter occasionally drifted from the garden beyond. He asked after Nathaniel's health first, then his tenants, then the state of the roads between Kent and Sussex, working his way with the patience of a man accustomed to depositions toward the question he had actually come to ask, which he finally arrived at over the second cup of tea, phrased with the elaborate carelessness of someone who believed himself subtle. He had heard, from this quarter and that Amberley kept a ward these days, a girl of some 7 or 8 years, and he wondered, purely out of family feeling, whether the child had any connection to the Kirkland household, given that his uncle's health had lately grown uncertain, and a man in Edgar's position, heir presumptive to a dukedom, as he did not trouble to phrase modestly, found it prudent to understand exactly what claims might one day be made against an estate he expected, before very much longer, to inherit in full. Nathaniel set down his own cup with the unhurried precision of a man who had anticipated the question before it was asked, and told him, in a voice that gave away nothing beyond its perfect steadiness, that Iris was his ward by his own choosing and his own arrangement, that her origins were a private matter concerning no estate but his own, and that he found it curious a man so recently arrived in the county should have troubled himself to learn the child's age and situation in such particular detail before ever laying eyes on her. Edgar smiled at that, the thin, practiced smile of a man who has been told no and intends to return with a different question, and took his leave shortly after. But not before his gaze passed once more across the garden window, toward a small figure running barefoot through the grass, with a governess close behind her, in a manner that told Nathaniel, long before Edgar's carriage had cleared the drive, that this had been merely the first of such visits, and not the last. The question Edgar had asked so carefully over tea did not remain confined to that single afternoon, but began instead to travel through the county in the particular manner such questions did, passed from a coachman who had overheard something in a Maidstone inn, to a housemaid who repeated it to a cousin in service at the Ainsworth residence, until it arrived, inevitably, at Lady Constance's own breakfast table, dressed in speculation far more colorful than anything Edgar himself had actually said aloud. By the time the story had made its 3rd or 4th crossing of the county, it had acquired details no one present at Amberley had ever confirmed. That the girl was the natural daughter of a scandal so severe the old Duke of Kirkland himself had paid to have it buried. That Amberley's silence on the matter was not discretion, but complicity. That a duke who would raise another man's shame as his own must have some private stake in seeing it concealed that had nothing to do with charity. Cecilia heard the rumor first from the vicar's wife, delivered with the studied gentleness of a woman who believed she was doing a kindness by warning her of what was being said, and felt the old, familiar coldness settle into her chest that she had hoped, after 6 quiet years, never to feel again. The particular dread of watching a truth she had guarded so carefully begin to unravel in other people's mouths, reshaped into something crueler and more convenient than the truth had ever actually been. She said nothing of it to Iris, who remained mercifully too young and too occupied with her own small concerns to notice the shift in how certain families now greeted her in the village. But she found herself watching the girl more closely in company after that, alert to any unkindness disguised as courtesy. It was Nathaniel who raised the matter first between them, one evening after Iris had been put to bed, finding Cecilia in the library with a piece of mending she had not touched in the better part of an hour, and asking her plainly whether she had heard what was now being said of the child in 3 counties' worth of drawing rooms. She told him she had, and told him too what frightened her most about it. Not the cruelty of strangers, which she had long since learned to endure, but the fact that a rumor built on so little truth had nonetheless landed, by accident or by design, remarkably close to the actual shape of what neither of them had ever spoken aloud, and that a story circling that near the fire needed only the smallest true spark to catch entirely. Within a fortnight, the rumor had outpaced any effort either of them might have made to contain it, arriving in London itself before the autumn assemblies began, carried by exactly the kind of correspondence that traveled faster and further than any mail coach could manage. The private letters of society women to their sisters and cousins, each one embellishing what the last had already exaggerated, until the story reached its most complete and least accurate form in a drawing room on Grosvenor Square, where a marchioness Nathaniel had known for 20 years repeated to him, at a dinner he had reluctantly attended, a version of his own household's history so thoroughly distorted that he found himself, for one unguarded moment, uncertain whether to laugh at its absurdity or to leave the table entirely rather than sit through another course pretending not to have heard it. What struck him most, riding back to Kent the following day in a carriage that felt considerably colder than the weather alone accounted for, was not the cruelty of what was being said, but the strange, corrosive half-truth buried inside it. That everyone now seemed to agree Iris was connected to some great house's shame, without a single person among them having troubled to learn whose shame it actually was, so that Kirkland's name remained, for the moment, entirely unspoken in every account he heard, protected by nothing more than the collective imagination's preference for a more dramatic villain than an old man too proud to claim his own blood. He understood, with the particular clarity that comes from watching a danger arrive slowly enough to see its full shape before it reaches you, that the rumor's current vagueness was not safety, but a kind of held breath, and that it would take only one person with the right information and the wrong motives to name the truth aloud and turn 6 years of careful silence into a scandal neither he nor Cecilia nor Iris herself would be able to outrun. He said as much to Cecilia that same night, laying out plainly what he had heard and from whom, and watched her absorb it with the same steadiness she brought to every difficulty the household had faced since the night he first carried Iris through Amberley's doors. Though he noticed, too, the particular way her hands stilled over her needlework when he mentioned Edgar Winslow's name specifically, as though she had already begun, privately and without telling him, to suspect precisely where the more dangerous version of this rumor was likely to originate, and precisely how little time remained before someone decided that a whispered scandal in 3 counties' drawing rooms was not so satisfying as one confirmed, in writing, by someone who had actually been present at Kirkland Hall the night it began. The rumor that reached Grosvenor Square was cruel, but it was also, mercifully, wrong in nearly every particular, which was the only reason it hadn't yet done real damage. What neither Nathaniel nor Cecilia knew was that the truth, the actual truth, was already sitting sealed in a drawer at Kirkland Hall, in a housekeeper's trembling hand, and it was about to travel a great deal faster than any rumor ever could. Mr. Boehm's Pemberton, the same solicitor who had drawn up the papers dismissing Cecilia from Kirkland Hall's employment 6 years before, though he had not personally delivered that particular unpleasantness at the time, arrived at Amberley on a grey morning in late October, sent, he explained, with the careful formality of a man reciting instructions rather than delivering his own opinions, on behalf of His Grace the Duke of Kirkland, whose health had lately declined enough that his affairs required, in the solicitor's phrase, a certain tidiness, before matters progressed any further. He was shown into Nathaniel's study rather than the drawing-room, a distinction Nathaniel made deliberately, and he spoke for some minutes about matters of no real consequence. A boundary dispute settled years ago, a question of tithes, before arriving, with visible reluctance, at the actual purpose of his visit, which was to inquire, on his employer's behalf, whether any documentation existed at Amberley concerning the girl known as Iris, her parentage, or the circumstances under which she had come to reside there. Nathaniel answered him with the same composed refusal he had given Edgar weeks before, and watched Mr. Pemberton receive it with something closer to relief than frustration, as though the solicitor had come dreading a confrontation, and found himself instead granted an excuse to return to London with nothing accomplished and no further pressing required of him that day. It was only as he was preparing to leave that Cecilia entered the study briefly to deliver a message concerning the afternoon's correspondence, and it was in that moment, brief as it was, that Nathaniel observed something he would turn over in his mind for days afterward. Mr. Pemberton, a man who had looked him steadily in the eye through every uncomfortable question of the visit, could not, for the length of Cecilia's presence in the room, bring himself to look at her at all, addressing his farewell to a point somewhere beyond her shoulder, with the particular carefulness of a man avoiding a debt he knew he owed and had no intention of paying. Cecilia noticed it too, and said nothing of it until the solicitor's carriage had well and truly cleared the drive, at which point she told Nathaniel, quietly and without any of the bitterness the observation might have justified, that Mr. Pemberton had been the one who drafted the letter warning 3 separate households against employing her, on instructions he had never once questioned aloud, and that a man capable of writing such a letter without argument was not a man likely to volunteer. Now, any information that might undo 6 years of carefully maintained silence, which meant, she said, that whatever truth eventually surfaced about Iris would not come gently, through lawyers choosing honesty, but only through some far less orderly reckoning that neither of them could yet predict, and that both of them, increasingly understood, was drawing nearer with every season that passed. The letter arrived at Amberley addressed not to Nathaniel but to Cecilia directly, in handwriting she recognized within the first line as belonging to Mrs. Thorpe, the housekeeper who had served Kirkland Hall since before Cecilia's own brief tenure there, a woman who had watched her dismissal 6 years before with visible unhappiness she had never once been permitted to voice aloud. It had been written, Mrs. Thorpe explained in a hand that trembled with more than age, without the knowledge or permission of anyone above stairs, smuggled out through a nephew who drove the mail cart, because she had grown too old and too tired of carrying a silence that weighed on her more heavily. With each passing year, the old Duke's health continued its slow decline, and because she believed, whatever the consequences to herself, that someone besides the dying man and his frightened household ought to know the truth before it was buried along with him. What the letter contained was not confession so much as fragments. A name Cecilia had never been told, belonging to the young woman who had been Iris's mother, a distant relation of a clergyman's family in Dorset, brought to Kirkland Hall as a companion to the old Duke's late wife, and kept there After the Duchess's death, under circumstances Mrs. Thorpe described only obliquely, in the careful language of a servant unwilling to accuse her employer outright of anything she could not have proven in a court of law. She had died, the letter said, within days of the birth, of a fever the household physician privately believed had been worsened by neglect rather than nature. And the Duke had never once, in 6 years since, spoken the woman's name aloud in his own household, though Mrs. Thorpe had seen him more than once, standing before a locked drawer in his study, with an expression she had no name for beyond grief too proud to call itself by that word. Cecilia read the letter twice before she brought it to Nathaniel, and when she did, late that evening, in the quiet of his study with the fire burned low, she watched him absorb each fragment of it with the same stillness he had shown her the day he first asked her to return to Amberley's service, and understood, from the particular way his jaw set when he reached the physician's suspicion of neglect, that whatever restraint had governed his dealings with Kirkland House until that moment had just been tested in a manner from which it might not fully recover, that a man who had spent 6 years content to let a scandal remain vague and unnamed now possessed, for the first time, an actual name to attach to the grief he had been quietly raising as his own daughter for the better part of her life. Dr. Aldous Renner had attended Charles Winslow, Duke of Kirkland, for the better part of 11 years, long enough to have earned the particular trust a dying man extends only to those who have already seen him at his weakest. And it was in that capacity, on an October evening when the household believed his patient merely resting, that he heard the old Duke speak of the child for the first time in 6 years, without prompting or provocation. Charles had asked, without preamble, whether a physician was bound by the same discretion as a priest, and upon being assured that he was, had spoken for the better part of an hour in the halting, unguarded manner of a man who had rehearsed a confession so many times in solitude that its final delivery came almost as a relief, that he had loved the girl's mother in the quiet, ordinary way a widower sometimes loves a woman his household considers beneath him, that he had lacked, when it mattered most, the courage to marry her before society could object, and that his silence in the years since had been not cruelty exactly, but a coward's arithmetic, in which every day he failed to acknowledge his daughter felt marginally easier to bear than the one before it, until 6 years had passed, and the debt had grown too large for him to imagine repaying at all. Renner had said little in response beyond the professional neutrality his position required, but he noted, in the private diary he kept of his more difficult patients, that the Duke's confession carried none of the relief such admissions were meant to bring, only a deepening despair at having said the truth aloud too late to matter to anyone who might have needed to hear it years before, and a fear, spoken almost as an afterthought, that Edgar Winslow's growing interest in the estate's succession meant the truth would surface regardless of what Charles himself decided to do about it, on terms considerably less generous than any he might yet arrange, while he still possessed the strength to arrange them. It was this fear, more than any restored tenderness toward the daughter he had never met, that prompted Charles to send for his own solicitor the following week, not Mr. Pemberton, whom he no longer entirely trusted with matters of such delicacy, but a second, more discreet man of business from London, and to begin, in the guarded language such documents required, the drafting of instructions he told no one at Kirkland Hall he was preparing, instructions that would not become known to Nathaniel, to Cecilia, or to Iris herself until a day considerably further along than any of them yet suspected, when the whole of London would gather in mourning clothes to learn exactly what the old Duke had finally decided to make right. He had carried the housekeeper's letter in his coat for 3 days before he found the courage to speak of it plainly to Cecilia beyond the bare facts she had already read for herself, choosing instead, on a night when Iris had gone to bed early with a cold, and the house had settled into the particular hush that made confidences easier, To sit with her in the library long after the fire wanted tending, and to ask her, without any of his usual reserve, what she believed the truth of the mother's name would mean for a girl who had grown up believing herself simply Nathaniel's ward, with no history attached beyond the 6 years she could actually remember. Cecilia had answered carefully, as she always did where Iris's welfare was concerned. But Nathaniel found himself, that particular evening, less interested in her measured counsel than in the plain fact of her presence across the hearth from him, steady in a way nothing else in his life had been steady since his wife's death. And it was somewhere in the middle of that realization that he came dangerously close to saying aloud something that had nothing to do with Iris at all. He had begun, in fact, to speak of the years since the child had arrived, of how thoroughly Cecilia's judgment had shaped every decision he had made regarding her upbringing, of how strange it now seemed to imagine the household functioning without her steadying presence in it, of how rarely, in 11 years of widowhood, he had trusted anyone's counsel as completely as he had come to trust hers, before some old, cautious instinct closed his mouth around the rest of it, the part that was not about Iris's welfare, but about his own quiet, unspoken conviction that he had built, without ever intending to, a second family around a woman he had originally hired only to mind a child's lessons. Cecilia, watching him stop himself mid-sentence with the particular abruptness of a man retreating from ground he had not meant to approach, said nothing to press him further, though she recognized, with a clarity that unsettled her more than she wished to admit, exactly what he had almost said, and exactly why he had not finished saying it. That a duke's ward and a disgraced governess's employer occupied, in the eyes of every drawing-room in Kent, positions too distant from equality to permit the kind of confession he had nearly made, whatever either of them might privately wish were true, and that the silence he retreated into that night was not indifference, but the same careful discipline he had spent 6 years applying to every danger threatening the fragile arrangement they had built around a child. Neither of them had been required by blood to love. It was Cecilia's dismissal that finally forced the question into the open, though the dismissal in question was not her own, but a threat delivered obliquely, through the same channels that had carried every other piece of gossip through the county that autumn. A suggestion, reaching her second hand through the vicar's wife, that Edgar Winslow had begun making inquiries not merely about Iris's origins, but about the propriety of an unmarried governess residing so many years under the same roof as an unmarried duke. Inquiries clearly intended to manufacture a second scandal to run alongside the first, one that would give Edgar grounds to argue, whenever his uncle's estate finally passed to him, that Amberley's household was unfit to retain guardianship of a child connected in any way to Kirkland's name. Nathaniel received this news with a stillness that Cecilia had learned, over 6 years, to recognize as fury too controlled to show itself plainly. And it was in the hour following that conversation, pacing the length of his study while Cecilia sat with her hands folded in the particular composure she brought to every crisis, that he arrived at the solution with the same deliberate practicality he applied to every difficult decision the estate required. That the surest way to remove any question of impropriety from their household, and the surest way to ensure Edgar's inquiries found nothing further to seize upon, was for the arrangement between them to become, in the eyes of the law, and of every drawing-room from Kent to London, entirely beyond reproach. He phrased the proposal, when it came, in exactly those terms, as a matter of protecting Iris and silencing Edgar, rather than as anything so unguarded as a declaration, telling Cecilia plainly that a marriage between them would answer every question their enemies might raise and settle, permanently, the question of who had the right to raise the girl they both already considered their own. And it was only when Cecilia, listening to this careful, reasonable, entirely practical argument, asked him quietly whether practicality was truly the whole of what he meant by it, That Nathaniel Vane, who had governed his own heart with the same iron discipline he applied to his ledgers for 11 long years, found himself unable, for once, to answer her with anything so simple as a fact. He did not answer her that evening, choosing instead the coward's grace of a night's postponement. But he returned to the question the following morning in the garden, where Iris was occupied some distance away with a hoop and stick that had occupied her attention since her last birthday, and told Cecilia, without the careful armor of practicality he had wrapped around the proposal the night before, that he had asked her to marry him for Iris's sake, because it was the argument he trusted himself to make, without his voice betraying how much more than practicality had shaped the question, and that the truer answer, the one he had been too disciplined a man to admit even to himself until Edgar's threats forced the whole matter into daylight, was that he could no longer imagine the shape of his own household, his own evenings, his own particular kind of quiet contentment, without her steady presence anchoring the center of it. Cecilia listened to this admission with the same stillness she brought to every moment that mattered most, though something in her expression softened in a manner Nathaniel had not seen since the earliest days of Iris's arrival, when the two of them had first discovered how thoroughly a shared devotion to one small girl could bind two otherwise cautious people together. And she told him, when she finally answered, that she had spent 6 years telling herself the affection she felt for this household was simply loyalty to a child who deserved better than the world had initially offered her, and had only lately begun to suspect that the word loyalty had grown too small to hold everything she actually felt toward the man who had built that household around the two of them. It was Iris, running back across the lawn with her hoop forgotten and her bonnet askew, who supplied the word neither adult had yet spoken plainly, asking with the guileless directness only a child possesses whether Cecilia was going to stay with them always now, as family does, and it was in answering her, Nathaniel kneeling to meet the girl's eyes, Cecilia's hand finding his shoulder without either of them planning the gesture, that the word family passed between the three of them for the first time without hesitation, without qualification, and without either adult flinching from a term that had, until that particular morning, always carried the careful reservation of something not quite theirs to claim. The bell reached Amberley before any formal word did, carried on a still November morning by the particular carrying quality air takes on just before winter, tolling from the parish church nearest Kirkland Hall in the slow, measured pattern the county had long ago learned to associate with the death of someone whose name required no further announcement. Nathaniel heard it first from the stable yard, where he had gone before breakfast to inspect a mare due to foal within the fortnight, and stood motionless for the length of several tolls before he understood what he was hearing, some old instinct from childhood, counting the bell's rhythm the way his own father had taught him, until the count confirmed what the direction of the sound had already suggested, that Charles Winslow, Duke of Kirkland, had died in the night, and that whatever reckoning the old man had spent his final months quietly arranging had now begun in earnest, whether any of them were prepared for it or not. He found Cecilia in the breakfast room already, and saw in her face before he had said a single word that she too had heard the bell and understood its meaning, and that some old grief she had carried privately for 6 years, not for the Duke himself, whom she had little cause to mourn, but for the young woman who had died in that same house under circumstances no one had ever properly grieved on her behalf, had risen in her at the sound of it, unexpected and unwelcome, the way old griefs sometimes surface hardest at the death of the very person responsible for causing them. She asked him, quietly, what he intended to do, and Nathaniel told her, with the same steadiness he brought to every difficult decision, that he did not yet know, but that whatever came next would not be decided in fear of Edgar Winslow, whatever claim the man now believed himself entitled to make. Iris, sensing gravity in the house though not yet understanding its source, asked at breakfast why everyone had grown so quiet, and Cecilia told her only that an old man had died, a duke from a house some distance away, and that such news made grown people thoughtful for a time. Which was true enough as far as it went, without burdening a 7-year-old with the full weight of what her guardians already understood. That the bell tolling over the bare November fields was not merely announcing a death, but beginning, whether the household at Amberley wished it or not. The slow unraveling of a silence 6 years in the keeping, one that neither love nor discretion would be able to hold shut very much longer. The bell was still tolling over the bare November fields when the first decision about that funeral was made. Not by anyone at Amberley, and not out of grief. Somewhere inside Kirkland Hall, a nephew who had spent months rehearsing his uncle's silence was already deciding exactly who would be permitted to mourn him, and who would not. The invitation arrived 4 days later, delivered by a rider in Kirkland livery, who waited in the hall with the particular impatience of a man given strict instructions to return with an answer, and Nathaniel read it standing in his study with Cecilia close enough to see, over his shoulder, exactly what had been so carefully constructed in its wording. A formal summons to the funeral of Charles Winslow, Duke of Kirkland, addressed with scrupulous correctness to His Grace the Duke of Amberley, and to no one else residing under his roof, the omission of any mention of his household so precise and so deliberate that it could only have been composed by someone who understood exactly what statement such an omission was intended to make before the whole of assembled London. Cecilia said nothing for a long moment, folding her hands in the particular composure she had spent 6 years perfecting for exactly such occasions. And it was Nathaniel who spoke first, saying with a bitterness he rarely permitted himself that Edgar had apparently begun exercising the authority of a dukedom before he had actually inherited it, arranging the old man's funeral as though it were already his own household to manage, and ensuring, through the simple mechanism of an invitation list, that no one need ever officially acknowledge a connection between Kirkland's name and the child both of them had raised for 6 years as their own. He asked Cecilia plainly whether she wished to attend regardless of the slight, understanding, as he asked it, that the choice carried real risk for her, standing uninvited in mourning clothes among a society that had spent years finding reasons to doubt her respectability. She answered him without hesitation, in the same tone she had used the day she told a room full of Kirkland's household staff exactly what she thought of a duke who would not claim his own blood, saying that she had held that child through her first fever and her first steps and every ordinary Tuesday in between, and that she did not require an engraved invitation to stand at the funeral of the man whose failures had shaped so much of what both she and Iris had suffered for it. That whatever London chose to make of her presence there, she intended to attend, and intended to bring Iris with her. Whatever consequence Edgar Winslow imagined such an appearance might carry for his own tidy account of the family's history. There was no dress in Cecilia's wardrobe suited to a duke's funeral, since 6 years of careful economy had left her with nothing beyond the plain, practical garments a governess's modest wages afforded, and she spent the better part of an afternoon before the appointed day, turning over what little black fabric she owned with the particular calculation of a woman accustomed to making do, before Nathaniel, learning of the difficulty from a housemaid who mentioned it in passing, sent to Maidstone for a length of proper mourning silk, and instructed the local seamstress, without asking Cecilia's permission first, to have a dress made to her measurements within 3 days, regardless of what it cost him. Cecilia protested when she learned of it, telling him plainly that she had no standing to appear at Kirkland's funeral dressed as though she belonged among the family's own mourners, and that such a gesture would only invite exactly the kind of scrutiny Edgar was already so eager to provoke. But Nathaniel answered her with a directness he had rarely permitted himself in 6 years of careful discretion. saying that she had earned more right to mourn that man's failures than half the guests who would fill Kirkland's church in their finest black, and that he would not have her stand among them, dressed in anything less than the dignity she had shown every single day since the night he first brought her a nameless child to raise. The dress arrived the evening before the funeral, plain but well cut, unadorned by any ornament that might invite accusation of presumption, and Cecilia stood before her, looking-glass in it, a long while that night, running her hands over fabric finer than anything she had worn since her own mother's funeral years before, understanding, as she studied her own reflection, that Nathaniel had given her not merely a garment, but an argument. That whatever London chose to say of her presence at Kirkland Hall the following day, she would stand there dressed as a woman entitled to grieve, and not as one asking permission to be there at all. Edgar Winslow had spent the 4 days since his uncle's death arranging every particular of the funeral with the meticulous attention of a man determined that nothing should occur to disturb the narrative he intended London to carry away from it, instructing the household staff on precisely which mourning rings should be distributed and to whom, which branches of the family should be seated nearest the front pew, and which subjects, delivered as a quiet word to Mr. Pemberton, who received the instruction with the same discomfort he had shown at Amberley weeks before, were on no account to be raised by anyone in his uncle's hearing, while the old man still drew breath. Chief among them any mention of a child whose existence Edgar intended to see buried alongside his uncle rather than acknowledged before the assembled peerage of 3 counties. He had learned, through channels he did not trouble to disclose even to Pemberton, that Amberley intended to attend regardless of the invitation's careful wording, and had responded not with the outrage such presumption might have warranted in a lesser man's household, but with a colder, more practical satisfaction, reasoning that a duke's ward and a governess of doubtful reputation, appearing uninvited at so solemn an occasion, would only confirm, before witnesses of consequence, exactly the impropriety he had spent months suggesting characterized the Amberley household. That their appearance, far from threatening his position, might in fact hand him the very justification he required to raise, publicly and with apparent reluctance, the question of whether such a household was fit to retain guardianship of any child connected, however distantly, to a family of Kirkland's standing. What Edgar did not know, and could not have anticipated, despite every careful arrangement he had made in the 4 days since his uncle's death, was that Charles Winslow had spent his final autumn drafting instructions with a second, more discreet solicitor entirely outside Edgar's knowledge or Pemberton's oversight, instructions sealed and lodged against precisely this eventuality, to be produced at a moment Charles himself had specified with a precision that suggested he had understood, better than anyone credited a dying man for understanding, exactly how his nephew intended to conduct the day, and exactly what kind of reckoning would be required to undo it in front of everyone Edgar had so carefully arranged to witness his own version of events instead. The church at Kirkland was fuller than Nathaniel had seen any church in years, its pews crowded with the particular density of families who had traveled considerable distances to be seen mourning a duke whose actual company, in life, few among them had especially sought. And it was into this crowded, correctly solemn assembly that Nathaniel and Cecilia entered with Iris between them, taking a place near the rear of the nave, where the eyes that turned toward them did so with the careful, sideways discretion of people determined to appear as though they had noticed nothing unusual at all. Edgar Winslow, seated in the family's front pew in the black he wore with the particular satisfaction of a man already measuring the estate for its next master, glanced back only once, his expression settling into the same cold arithmetic Nathaniel had watched him perform 6 years of visits before. A brief assessment of whether their presence could yet be turned to advantage, followed by a small, private confidence that it could. The service itself proceeded with the unremarkable correctness such occasions demanded, The vicar's eulogy touching lightly on the old duke's public virtues, and passing, as such eulogies always did, over whatever private failures the departed had carried unspoken to his grave. And it was only as the final hymn concluded, and the congregation began the small, rustling movements of people preparing to file out toward the churchyard, that a man none of the assembled family recognized rose from a pew near the side aisle, dressed in the plain, unremarkable black of a working solicitor, rather than the fashionable mourning of the family's own circle, and requested, in a voice pitched to carry the length of the nave, that the company remain seated a few moments longer, as he carried instructions from the late Duke himself, sealed and lodged against this exact occasion, which his Grace had been most particular should be read aloud, before any guest departed the church. Edgar came half out of his own pew at that, his composure slipping for the first time in 6 years of careful management, demanding to know by what authority a stranger proposed to address a family gathering with no notice given to the family itself. And it was Mr. Pemberton, summoned forward by a small gesture from the stranger, and looking, for the first time since Nathaniel had known him, entirely uncertain of his own footing, who confirmed in a voice gone unsteady that the second solicitor's authority was genuine, that the late Duke had indeed lodged such instructions some weeks before his death through channels Mr. Pemberton himself had known nothing of until that very morning, and that whatever the sealed papers contained, the whole of the assembled company was now legally and irrevocably bound to hear it. The stranger, Mr. Grantley, as he introduced himself before breaking the seal on the document he carried, read the late Duke's words in the plain, unadorned voice of a man delivering exactly what had been written and nothing more, and the church that had settled into its polite, restless anticipation of departure grew instead entirely still, as the first sentences made clear that this was no ordinary instruction concerning mourning rings or funeral expenses, but a formal declaration witnessed and notarized weeks before Charles Winslow's death, acknowledging before God and before the whole of his family that he had fathered a daughter by a woman he had loved and failed to marry, that the child lived still under the name Iris at the household of the Duke of Amberley, and that he wished it known, publicly and without further concealment, that she was his own blood and deserved whatever the law's limits on a dukedom's inheritance. Every recognition and provision a father owed a daughter he had been too great a coward to claim in life. Mr. Grantley did not stop there, but continued to a second portion of the document, in which the late Duke addressed, by name, the woman who had once served as the child's nurse, and had been dismissed from his household for the crime of speaking honestly on the girl's behalf. Cecilia Fairweather, whom he named specifically and without qualification as a woman of greater honor than his own household had shown her, instructing his solicitors to see her name formally and publicly cleared of any imputation against her character, and expressing, in words that seemed to cost the dying man considerable effort to commit to paper, his regret that he had allowed 6 years to pass before finding the courage to say so. It was at this point in the reading that a manservant, instructed weeks before by the late Duke himself and waiting only for this signal, stepped forward from the side of the church, carrying a mantle of deep blue trimmed in the unmistakable gold thread of the Kirkland crest, and laid it, following the written instruction. Mr. Grantley now read aloud, over the shoulders of a 7-year-old girl who had arrived at her own father's funeral, wrapped in nothing grander than a plain gray cloak 6 years old and long since softened by washing. Iris, who understood little of wills or legitimacy, but understood entirely the weight of fine wool suddenly settling warm across her shoulders, looked up first at Cecilia and then at Nathaniel with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and wonder, and it was Nathaniel who knelt beside her there in the crowded aisle, adjusting the mantle's fall with the same careful attention he had once given a lopsided plait of hair, and told her, quietly enough, that only she and Cecilia could hear it, that this was simply the world finally agreeing, in its own slow and clumsy fashion, to a truth the three of them had known and lived inside for years already. The mantle had been placed. The words had been read aloud in front of every family that mattered in 3 counties. But a silence that total, falling over that many people at once, can only break in one of 2 directions, and not even Edgar Winslow, watching it settle over the church, could yet say which way it was about to fall. The silence that followed Mr. Grantley's reading was unlike any Nathaniel had witnessed in a church full of London's assembled peerage. Not the polite hush of ordinary solemnity, but something heavier and more total. The particular silence of several hundred people simultaneously recalculating every assumption they had carried into that church that morning, and it held for a length of time that felt, to everyone present, considerably longer than the few seconds the clock would have actually recorded. Broken finally, not by any word from the family itself, but by the small, unmistakable sound of Lady Constance Ainsworth's fan closing with a snap in the 3rd pew from the front. A sound that seemed, in that particular quiet, as loud as a door slamming shut on 6 years of careful gossip. Edgar Winslow rose from his own pew with the visible intention of objecting, of demanding the document's authenticity be questioned, of salvaging from the wreckage of his uncle's confession whatever advantage might still be extracted from outrage. But he found, looking out across a church full of faces no longer arranged in the polite deference his position as heir had commanded only minutes before, that the ground beneath such an objection had already shifted entirely. That a room full of people who had spent months whispering behind gloved hands about Amberley's disgraceful household now regarded him instead with the particular cold assessment reserved for a man who had spent 4 days arranging a funeral specifically designed to bury a truth his own uncle had died, determined to speak aloud, and he sat back down without completing whatever protest he had risen to make, understanding, in that silence, that no argument he could construct would recover what the moment had already cost him. Cecilia stood very still through all of it, one hand resting lightly on Iris's newly mantled shoulder, and felt something she had not expected to feel after 6 years of carrying her own dismissal as a private, permanent wound. Not vindication exactly, since nothing in the old Duke's belated confession could return the years his cowardice had cost her, but something quieter and, in its way, more sustaining. The simple and long-delayed relief of hearing her own honesty named aloud by the very man who had once punished her for it, in front of every person in 3 counties who had ever doubted her character on his household's word alone. They left the church that afternoon in a carriage considerably slower than the crowd's eager departure warranted, Iris seated between them, still wrapped in the crested mantle she had refused, with the particular stubbornness of a 7-year-old given something precious, to remove even for the short walk from the church door. And it was somewhere along the quiet road back toward Amberley, with the gray November light softening toward evening, that Nathaniel reached across the carriage and took Cecilia's hand in his, without either of them remarking on the gesture. The two of them sitting in a silence entirely different from the one they had just left behind. Not the heavy, recalculating silence of a stunned congregation, but the plain, settled quiet of 2 people who had spent 6 years building something in private that the whole of London had just, however belatedly, been forced to acknowledge as real. The old gray cloak, the one that had carried Iris through Amberley's doors on a rain-soaked night 6 years before, still hung in its chest at the foot of the nursery bed when they arrived home, and it was Cecilia who suggested, watching Iris fold the new mantle carefully over a chair before bed, that the plain gray coat ought not to be put away after all, but kept somewhere Iris could see it easily, so that she might grow up understanding both halves of her own story. Not merely the crest that now legitimately named her a Kirkland by blood, but the unmarked, unremarkable coat that had named her, long before any solicitor's document made it official, as loved. Their own wedding followed within the season, quietly and without the grand assembly. Amberley's standing might have commanded, attended by a household that had spent 6 years learning to hold a family together around a silence no one outside its walls had understood. And it was Iris herself, standing between them at the small country church nearest Amberley, in a dress considerably plainer than the mantle she still kept folded at the foot of her bed, who supplied the only toast the occasion required, telling anyone within hearing that her mother and her father were only now making official what she had known to be true since she was old enough to braid her own hair, that a family was never really made by a name a solicitor wrote down, but by every ordinary morning someone chose, without being asked to stay.